It's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. David Waldstreicher is Distinguished Professor of History and American Studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is a renowned historian of early American and 19th century America, early and colonial and into 19th century America, with particular interests in political history, cultural history, slavery and anti-slavery, and print culture. His recent publication, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, A Poet's Journeys Through American Slavery and Independence, received accolades from the New York Times, Oprah, and the New York Times Book Review. And more recently, it was listed as one of the must-reads for 2023, and I would certainly agree and attest to that. Previous publications by David include Slavery's Constitution, From Revolution to Ratification, and Runaway America, Benjamin Franklin, Slavery and the American Revolution. He's a contributor to the Boston Review, The Atlantic, and also a contributing author to HSP's 200th anniversary commemorative volume, which just came out officially last week. So David, thank you for writing that wonderful essay, not surprisingly, about Phillis Wheatley. Kimmika Williams-Witherspoon is a Senior Associate Dean of Strategic Initiatives and Innovation in the Center for the Performing and Cinematic Arts at Temple University. She serves as a full professor, specializing in urban theater and community engagement in the theater department in the School of Theater, Film, and Media Arts. She is a poet and a playwright. She's written over 28 plays, and 20 productions, 13 stage readings, and 8 one-woman shows. In addition to dozens of poetry performances nationally and internationally. Her book publications include Through Smiles and Tears, The History of African American Theater, and The Secret Messages in African American Theater, Hidden Meaning Embedded in Public Discourse. She's also published 11 books of poetry. Her scholarly work centers around pedagogy, women's issues, the African diaspora, performance rituals, and community engagement. She did a great interview on WURD this morning that I found exciting and made me want to hear even more from our speakers. With that, I'm going to turn it over to them. We're going to invite each of them to spend a few minutes talking to us about why Phillis Wheatley, why now, and why she is relevant to us in 2023. Kimmika, would you like to go first, and then David, and then we'll open a dialogue between our two speakers. I'll come back at the end for a little Q&A. Again, Kimmika and David, thank you.
Thank you, and welcome. Good evening, everyone. Why Phillis is important to me, she was the first poet that I found in the libraries coming through the Philadelphia school system as a young girl that looked like me. You didn't find very much, at that time through K through 12. I'm super old here, but you didn't find that much in terms of poetry until you get later into perhaps the late 1800s and then into the 1900s, and then somewhere around the 1950s, it kind of burgeons. But as looking for the first, looking for a woman and looking for someone that loved words and poetry as much as I did, she was the first one I found. And in fact, I wrote a paper about her when I was in the 4th grade that I still have to this day, complete with the engraving that was found on her text, her published book, copies of it that I cut out of a calendar and embedded into my, my report. I think it's important that we remember, resurrect, bring back to the forefront. Phillis Wheatley has been allowed to go back into the annals of ambiguity because so many individuals thought that her work did not speak to a particular resistance or resistant ethos. And I take exception to that. But more than anything else, we're a week away from the date of her death so many years ago on December 5th. And I think that this is a very good time to remember not just the ways in which race and gender and geography affect the ways in which you can navigate the world, but how enslavement really shed a light on what was possible and the limitations of what couldn't happen. And that she skillfully navigated that divide before the tragedy forced her to fall in. And I think that's why I'm very grateful to David for doing this, for bringing this book to the forefront, for doing that deep dive so that we can resurrect her with new eyes, with a lens that looks at just how revolutionary it was for this young woman to publish at 13, to write one of the first publications, not the first, but one of the first publications by an African American, and to have communicated with the leaders and heads of state on this side of the Atlantic and across the pond, and all under the guise of the shackles of enslavement.
Thank you. That was wonderful as always. It's such a privilege and a joy to be sitting up here with Kimmika Williams-Witherspoon. We were colleagues at Temple University for 10 years, served on important committees and committees that wanted to be important, and fought some good fights together. And I'm really grateful that she was willing to come out and talk about Wheatley and a little bit about my book. But we're going to focus on Wheatley, and it's also especially appropriate, as you've heard, and I'm sure many of you already knew, about Kimmika's own work in both drama and poetry. It's especially appropriate to have her here today when we have this wonderful exhibit downstairs that is a dialogue between the Historical Society and its archives, its collections, its several first and early editions of Wheatley's works, of Wheatley's manuscripts, of a rare copy of a broadside of Wheatley's poetry that shows just how, that demonstrates an example of just how popular and important and recognized she was as a poet during her lifetime. So the history side, and the even antiquarian side, because as we were marveling as we came up, it's just we geeks get such a thrill of seeing the real stuff from the 1770s right there in front of us, instead of the reproductions. And you just notice things every time. You just notice something you didn't notice before when you see the original. It's always astounding. And a contemporary poet, a young poet, writing something that responds to Wheatley and plays with some of her themes and imagines a dialogue with her. And these artists who make books, who interpreted both Wheatley's poem and Ms. Darius's poem, and the relationship between them that we might run with and think about. And it's a great example of the kind of work that Black poets and playwrights have been doing for some time, and there's a profusion of them right now. I've seen or been in dialogue with or heard about at least 4 plays about Wheatley that have either been produced recently or in development. And what's wonderful about them is that they're all different and they're all good.
Yeah.
And they all take a different lens, a different angle on Wheatley and her significance. And instead of dwelling on instead of dwelling on her early death or only the limits that she was placed and thus what she couldn't do, they explore what she did do, right, and why, and also even they suggest, by focusing on different moments, and even if the most of the drama is about one moment, suggesting that there's a before and after, as theater can do, even when it's just a few scenes. These works are doing something that I was was very important for me to do in the book, which was to not just place her in a time, the Revolutionary era, the 18th century, but rather suggest that she was growing as an artist and responding to what was going on around her in a way that was both deeply personal about her experience in Boston, and then when she goes to London, and before that in West Africa, as much as we can figure out about what that might have been, because we have so little evidence for her particular experience. But also responding to her art, her poetry, her work, her career, as it were, develops in response also to public events. And that we can actually see her growing and doing that back and forth and figuring out who her audiences are and trying different modes out and trying out different voices and really pushing the boundaries. And so I tried to turn that into a story that tells us something about what a great artist she was. It's a biography of a writer. That's job one, but also tells us something about the nature of the American Revolution and the centrality of Black people and the problem of slavery in it. So this was kind of what was kind of my hidden agenda that I didn't know how much I would be able to develop or make central, but which gradually became something I became more and more confident that I could demonstrate through her life, even though I hope I didn't allow my agendas as a historian to take over completely. It is the method and one of the arguments of the book, so that. And to me, this is as you heard what some of my other book titles are. This is something I've been working on for a long time, and I guess one way for me to just shorthand it in the present moment, as we were asked to do, is to say we've sometimes been presented with, most recently and controversially, with two versions of history. One which is now known as the 1619 Project version, which is a Black-centered version of history that emphasizes the not so much change as persistence of oppression, and it's an excellent corrective and absolutely necessary. And the backlash to that has been this kind of backward-looking 1776 Project version, where everything was great, slavery was going to end anyway. Let's only look at the heroes and the Black people who signed on to the American project, like okay, we can say Frederick Douglass did because he said the Constitution was great and they really ended to end slavery, which is what he said at certain political moments, at certain times, for strategic reasons. So we have this kind of debate or controversy between what might seem to be a Black-centered version of the past and a revanchist white-centered version of the past. What I think Wheatley shows is that we really can't separate these stories. We can't understand either of them without each other. And rather than repolarizing or resegregating the past and the arts of the past, as well as the politics of the past, we need to see how they actually all the white people were very aware of the problem of slavery and of the Black people in their midst, and vice versa, and that was their world, very much like that's our world in Philadelphia, which is not to say that we don't live in segregated spaces and struggle with and against them, but that's not the whole story. There's a lot more going on. So I think I will. I was going to demonstrate this by talking about one of the Wheatley's early poems that's here in manuscript and in the exhibit downstairs, or the letter to Samuel Hopkins that's also downstairs, in which I talk a bit about in my little essay in the 200 Years volume. But I think I'd rather maybe just start the conversation, and maybe maybe we can come back to that. I'll refer to it if it seems germane.
Well, how about if I ask you a question? Because although I think I know, because I've heard a lot of interviews that you've done thus far, but I don't know if everyone in the room knows. Talk about the impetus of this project, where it started for you, and why it was important.
Okay. I can't not tell this story in Philadelphia, though because it is a story about my teaching at Temple. Of course, I had written a little bit about Wheatley in my first two books, And I had taught her in both history and in American Studies classes. So she was always in the back of my mind. But I don't think I ever would have thought that I could. At the time, there'd never been really a scholarly biography of Wheatley. Vincent Coretta published his later in 2011. But around 2008 or 9, I was teaching an American Studies class at Temple and throwing a lot of early anti-slavery literature at the students. And part of my agenda here was to sort of give context for people like Wheatley, who weren't as in your face as we expect real abolitionist activists to be. So we get to Wheatley, and of course we're talking about her poem On Being Brought from Africa to America, which has often been read. Henry Louis Gates has called it the most reviled poem, or in African-American literature, seems to throw Africa under the bus, seems to say she's grateful for her enslavement. And we're talking about, I'm talking with the class about that, and there's kind of a divide in the class between some vocal students, most of them white, who are saying, wow, she's really like doing something radical and challenging here. And on the other hand, a terrific African-American student, supported by a few others of various hues and backgrounds, who felt like that, I mean, she wasn't saying it she was saying it in a much more knowledgeable and articulate way, but like the argument was we can't really call it traditional, but it's so old that it could be called traditional argument that, well, no, she was kind of an Oreo. She's kind of mimicking white culture, pleasing white people. She's not really anti-slavery. Mm-hmm. So I say, okay, well, this is a teachable moment. What if both readings are viable? What if it depends on how you read it? What if people read it different ways? So I stood up on a chair and I read it in two different voices. I read it in that beseeching voice, like thanking the white people voice. And then I read it in a like ironic voice, like mocking, like you people want me to say these things, but actually I want you to like think twice about your racism, which is what I think is actually going on in the poem. So I was a bit of a setup, but like I think good teaching is, on the one hand, you're guiding the students. On the other hand, you're saying, okay, here are two different ways of seeing something. And the conversation got better after that. And that made me think, well, maybe I have something. Maybe I can play a constructive role in this long-standing debate, or contribute something as a historian with something of a literary bent to this story. And that really got me starting to think that maybe I could spin some kind of biography out of it.
And I think that's probably what I love the most about this text, is it's almost, it reads like someone's telling you a story. But it's filled with all of the complexity and nuances that the time period called for. You know, how the triangular trade started, what was the political economy of the day, what was the importance of slavery to sugar, to tobacco. You know, that there's all of these explanations of the historical realities that takes it out of the world of just facts and figures and even poetry, and makes it a story of America. So I think I'm drawn to it for that reason, but I'm also drawn to it because of the debate. You know, I went to Girls High before girls were allowed to go to Central. I have to always preface that. And I spent my entire time in the library while I was at Girls High, and that's what I meant, that this was an opportunity for me to find someone who looked like me, but who also sounded like me. Because in my family, because my parents were from the South, they were adamant about me learning the lingua franca, the language of commerce. And I recognized, even in the 9th grade, I don't know what that is, 12 years old, that that's what she was writing with. She was writing in the language that would allow her to navigate those sides of the two sides of the argument. Who am I? Where am I? How can I navigate this world? And for when I hear the story about the students, I recognize right away that most people who don't have access to the lingua franca couldn't really get Phillis. And I think that's today. But in the time period, in her own time, she was speaking to an audience that needed to know the hypocrisy of enslavement, right? So when you delve into this project, you start by declaring your argument, right? Like so many of the writers did during that period. And in your argument, are you trying to dissuade one side or the other, or are you trying to bring both sides together?
Mm. Well, I had a lot of help. I think the ground shifted more since I started to think about writing about Wheatley for as broad an argument, or as broad an audience as I could find, where certainly the scholarly work and even the popular representations definitely went more toward, or more back toward what it had been, say around the turn of the century, where there were Phillis Wheatley clubs and Phillis Wheatley YMCAs and Phillis Wheatley libraries. Phillis Wheatley was recognized as a really important Black first and as an inspirational figure, as she had been for the abolitionists in the early 19th century. I talk a little bit about this aspect of her after, what I call her afterlife, in the last chapter of the book. And so the tide shifted after the 60s and 70s, where really innovative Black women, literary critics and poets, had to really fight to say, no, she's really interesting, she's really important to us. We hear something in her and can identify with what she had to struggle against as a writer and as a thinker. And so, but I did, I think what I took from the other side, as it were, was what it got right was that the debate about her was really, really important to Black people. That she wasn't isolated. She had a relationship to that community that everybody has thought was important, and not just her white evangelical sponsors, but also Black people at the time and ever since have really debated issues of identity and politics in relation to her, and the alternatives that she played with, and the languages, and her and for many, the question of audience, the question of what it means to be talking to multiple audiences at the same time, potentially, and then sometimes not, that she was doing this, and that her story is bound up with everything that's happened since in Black political and intellectual and artistic life, and even the mostly male Black critics in the Black arts movement, and before that, James Weldon Johnson, for example, even they got that they had to say something about her. That there is no talking about the tradition without talking about Phillis Wheatley and having some kind of a position about her. So I guess I could say in a way, I'm with both, but realizing just how much I was following in the footsteps of the women who kept her alive was certainly something that made me feel better about going about it the way I was, and putting the emphasis on what she was trying to do in the context of what her audience would hear, and then emphasizing how she kept pushing the envelope repeatedly, and that we can see that from very early on and progressively. Yes, you could say she doesn't write a lot of poems about slavery, but she writes more about slavery over time, for example.
As she ages.
Yes.
Yes, and we forget that she starts as a very young poet, and you know, just like with any other thing as an artist, as a creative, the more experiences you have, the more you can infuse the work with those new interpretations of that experience. And what I dislike, I'll say it out loud, about those individuals who demonize Phillis Wheatley and who have done it over the years, you know, great literary figures and scholarly figures that we won't call them by name because I like my job. But anyway, what I dislike is, would they have done that if she were a man? And so the gender component always upsets me. In your text, you talk about switching registers, and that's how we can recognize it, right? You know, so that you're born in the 1753, you're enslaved at 1761, you're growing through all of these political turmoils in America, including the Revolutionary War. You grow to young womanhood. And so your ability to articulate what you're seeing is going to change as you age and gather these experiences, but you're always going to have to switch registers. And I think that's the way I would love our students and readers to read Phillis Wheatley today. But I still think, though, how can I say this? That the ways in which she acquired new languages once enslaved in this country. And I have to caveat that. So every African brought to this country forcibly during the enslavement process, except for those born aboard ship, came with multiple languages. We have to say that because of the nature of Africa, the ways in which barter and trade systems happen. You had to have multiple languages in order to do that. And there were no fixed borders until individuals carved up maps and made those fixed borders. So most enslaved Africans brought to this country were multilingual. The ways in which she acquired new languages here, English, teaching herself, or Mary and Nathaniel teaching her Latin, translating the Ovid, however these things happen, that's also going to people the ways in which you see character, you build image, you craft words. But the symbolism that you point out in your text are the images, the gods, the metaphors that she's drawn to in those classic Enlightenment pieces, classic Greek, classic Roman pieces. That's what tells the hidden truth. That's my whole thing, the hidden transcript. That's the revolutionary Phillis Wheatley that nobody sees. What do we do about that? What can we do?
What can we do? What can we do? Well, let me. I'll talk a bit about what I did, and then I'll say why I find it inspiring potentially. So Kimmika is referring to a central move I make in the book is to say that rather than seeing her neoclassicism, which is to say her building off of the Augustan poets who were themselves make so many references to Greek and Roman poets. So this is a thing. This is the big thing in 18th century British literature. Rather than that being, oh, she's copying, she's mimicking this stuff that doesn't speak to her, that actually she read this literature, and I had the advantage of ignorance. I had not read this stuff before, even though I was an English major, as well as a history major in college. And I actually read some Pope in high school, but we read Rape of the Lock. We didn't read, we just didn't read that Pope.
See, Girls High made us read everything.
Yeah, okay, well, you had a better education than I did. So I had never read, I knew some Greek and Roman drama from hanging out with theater nerds in college, but besides that, I didn't know this stuff. So when I started to read it, even with the euphemisms in some of the translations, I started to notice that the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were, especially the Odyssey, which was obviously so important to her, and Pope's translation of the Odyssey was like bestseller in the 18th century, and that she was clearly made a lot of references to, that it's about war, it's about gods, it's about voyages, it's about enslavement, it's about the traffic in women, and it's often about these kind of underdogs, these servants, and these captured women who are somehow not as important as the great warriors, but yet they sometimes are the whole reason the action is happening. They're at the center. They make things happen. So I thought, okay, she's reading this, and like, okay, well, at the same time, she's obviously being Christianized and learning that language, but at the same time, and we can talk about how that may or may not have been useful to her as a language of liberation, and I would say yes and no, like, you know, as historians and say, but this neoclassical literature was something that she could use to think through and talk about aspects of her West African and Atlantic world experience that none of the white people wanted to hear about. Mm-hmm. She can't write a slave narrative about her time aboard ship or her time in West Africa. Olaudah Equiano would do that, but that's later. That's 20 years later, right? And he's got a movement in London behind him. This isn't possible, right?
And a woman.
Right, and she's a woman. So, but what are women doing in the 1750s and 60s? They're starting to publish poetry on their own. A lot of it anonymous, but it's a thing. Servant poets, women poets at this time is like the new exciting thing. And in England, aristocrats are like competing over, look, I found the washerwoman poet of the year, you know, like, and I'm going to get her poems published. And this is going to show that all this money and power I have is, you know, like I deserve it because I have good taste. Like that part of it I figured out very late, like I was halfway through the book and I was like, oh, I finally get it. Patronage. It's all about patronage. And she knows this. Yeah. People know it, but she knew it. It was obvious. She read their books. These guys who were the patrons and figured
and the newspapers
the newspaper, and she reads it all, she figures it out, and she sets things up so that she can be one of these figures and go to London and get her book published. So she learned. So these languages, they're literally languages, but they're also like languages in the smaller sense of subcultures. She learns the Christian one, she learns the neoclassical one, she learns the patriotic political one. And that was why I was going to talk about the Stamp Act poem. This is the first place where we see her engaging with that and trying to, but actually she kind of in that poem, in the first draft of it that we have here from at the historical side, she actually overemphasizes gods and the monarchy. It's like it actually is like it's kind of like a rough draft. It's too rich. It's too neoclassical. It doesn't like, and what's great is you compare it to the version that's in her book 5 years later. You see that she's getting it. She's better at it. She's not only is it better as a poem in terms of formally, it's also she's like much more in tune with the way the patriots are thanking the king, not like overdoing it. You know, so I think so she's saying, oh, okay, gods, kings, I get it. Like she's doing a West African and Greek or Roman version of it, but then she's like adapting to the like basically American Whig or patriot version of it by the time it ends up in the poem 5 years later. That's what I argue.
So the Phillis Wheatley that you introduce us to is strategic, is intentional, is first of all has incredible intellectual capacity. Is a linguist, you know, a wordsmith, and is a political, I don't know what the word is, but she's very much in tune to the politics both on this side of the Atlantic as well as in London. She knows who to court, who to write a praise poem for, and what figures deserve the elegy. That's phenomenal for the 1700s for a Black woman enslaved. And there's so many individuals who didn't see Wheatley in that way. So for the women who kept her alive, and William Wells Brown, he wrote something about her too. There were some men, some African-American writers who appreciated her, but there were so many, starting with Paul Laurence Dunbar, who didn't see her that way.
Yeah, and I
I'm
think
going to trail off there because I don't know where I want to go.
well, yeah, it was a part of their real canonization of their own tradition that
Patriarchy.
that led them to kind of make certain choices. And there was also I guess one way to let them, we could partly let them off the hook would be to say that, and the times they're doing this in the late 19th and early and to mid 20th century, 18th century poetry is out and romantic poetry is in. Real poets write about their feelings and their selves, right? And Wheatley does that, but she does it like she it's very sometimes indirect.
Yeah.
And she gets more and more self-conscious because everyone's always asking her about herself and how did you become such a genius? Who taught you? All these questions that they're asking her that actually have been telescoped into this idea of a trial, that she gets put on trial before the Boston Worthies. And this has become a kind of trope that it never actually happened.
It's a myth.
It's a myth. It never actually happened. It didn't need to happen. They already knew who she was. She'd written elegies for them and their family members. They signed the attestation, which shows up in her book, because they're it's like a blurb today. It's well, some blurbs are your publisher sends it to some famous person and they actually read it and like it, and then they blurb your book even though you don't know them. But most of the time, it's actually the people you know who blurb your book, or who there's some it's much less than 6 degrees of separation between between the author and the blurber. It's like that. That they wouldn't have blurbed her, and the reason they needed to sign it was because the manuscript was going over to London to be printed. And those people don't know it, so they need eyewitnesses to show it. But everyone in Boston knows exactly who she is. And so the problem with the image of the trial, one of the problems with it, is that it actually makes it actually hyper feminizes her, and it makes it she's one woman among 20 all these men.
White male gaze.
Yeah, and that's not the way it was at all. It's not that she didn't have to deal with a white male gaze, but they're not the only players in this drama, and they're not the only people who make or break her project. But the kind of poetry she wrote did go out of style. But now the poetry that Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote and that even was popular in the 50s and 60s, that's out of style too. Right. So she doesn't seem so weird. She just seems just as weird as every other earlier generation's poets, I guess.
And it ebbs and flows, right? She loved the rhyme couplet, which was particular to that genre and that time period. But then again, there were those individuals in the early 1920s who went back to the rhyme couplet. So I don't necessarily think that people should take exception to that part. I think what worries me particularly about younger poets who don't read, that younger poets should read. As Sonia Sanchez used to teach us, you can't call yourself a poet unless you read poetry, but okay, fine. But I think that a lot of the references are so alien to the younger generation that, maybe that's a shame on us for the education system. I don't know, because I don't want to get in trouble, but it's something to think about.
Right. Well, there's one of the paradoxes of these modes of poetry in the 18th century is it's not just that there are the learned references and the Christian ones that contemporary readers might not get. It's also that the way poetry was occasional. So the references are part of what makes the poetry interesting is that it's for an occasion that everybody knows about. And there are poems in newspapers for this reason. And so certainly there are formulaic things and there are references to earlier great poets and they're riffing off each other. But there's also a kind of so what I'm saying is some of the very things that made poetry popular and political
don't exist anymore.
are the things that make it harder to understand now.
Right. I mean, there was a time where for every major event, poetry was published in the newspaper. But, well, trying to publish a newspaper is problematic too. So that's another story. Yeah. Okay.
But we might think of it again to come back to the plays, and also I'm sure well, I don't know if there's going to be I joke in that last chapter about like I'm waiting for Wheatley to come to Broadway. Like I'm sure they're going to be more.
It may very well be.
It may very well happen. It's definitely dramatic enough and definitely poetic enough, and also there are going to be more documentaries and things of that sort. Maybe performance and drama is the way we do this now, and the way we make it possible to hear her. Though it's just wonderful though. And I haven't been in the classroom as much with undergraduates in recent years. So I can't say whether things are changing, but I'm just struck by like how many people tell me that they really get her as a poet or appreciate her as a poet. So I don't feel as weird that I did as much as I used to, and I can't really I suggest that's the case when I'm commenting on this at the end of the book, but I don't say why, because I don't really know why. I don't really know whether are we just more we're more careful when we're judging work by Black women than we used to be, or is it kind of more interest in the period, or is it like I'd like to think what it is that she was a great poet and spoke to universal themes as well as particular political and experiential ones. I see that in her, and in fact, I do argue that she herself was a universalist and really had an egalitarian sensibility. So I'd like to think that's part of it, but I don't really know.
So, sort of tied up with that, do we know as much as we know, or revere her as much as we do because of the Wheatleys?
because the Wheatleys succeeded in positioning her as
being part of
a child genius.
Yeah, capitalizing on the so-called precociousness, or
right. So yeah, no, that is part of it, because there's a direct line between the look at this child African genius thing that the Wheatleys did as a part of what was an evangelical project, and I think also a project about reforming slavery, saying, okay, well, maybe that kind of slavery they're doing in the West Indies or in the South is not so great, but maybe the kind we're doing here is okay if we educate them, if we convert them. Like, it's really not that different than like how we treat other children, how we treat other indentured servants and such. So there's a direct line from that to the fact that how most people get to know Wheatley in the late 20th century is by reading young adult books and kids' books about her, because there's a long tradition of writing, and these are the books that got me interested in history, books about famous people from the past that center on the story of how they grew up. Like, okay, well, we know they became president, but like not 8 of the 10 chapters are about like George Washington in knee breeches, and like in short pants, and well, he always wore short pants, right? But like until before he becomes George Washington, right? Before he becomes the general, right? So so these were the kind of books I read, and so Wheatley's perfect for that, because her whole life is before she's an adult, right? Or most of it, right? Like only the last chapter, and we know so little actually about her married adult last 6 years that it's just. It was these to spin these kind of semi-fictional, inspiring books for girls and for African Americans and for anybody who wants to be a writer. I mean, there've been so many of them, and that's I think that, well, that sort of certainly has laid the groundwork for continuing this image of her as a precocious genius who's a child. But I guess the flip side of that might be that she's someone who is made rather than who makes herself.
And is still enslaved, right?
still
You know, so that
enslaved, right.
is only manumitted just months before Susanna dies.
Right.
You know, the whole trip to London, while I think she was part of the orchestration of it, was carried out by the Wheatleys. You know, and Nathaniel took her, Nathaniel determined what needed to happen while we were there. Nathaniel was part of the reason why she has to return, because Susanna gets ill. And, you know, so that there are all of these other influences that we never really unpack. And is she really, is she given her freedom so that she doesn't look bad, so that the Wheatleys don't look bad after being this smashing success in London?
I lay out 4 possible scenarios for her emancipation. But I think the one thing I'm most confident of is that we don't know, we're not sure which one is actually the true one. Like whether they had planned it all along, or whether they did it, like as she says in one letter, because of her friends in London said that she should be, and the Wheatleys were embarrassed. And so she says different things about it in different letters. And what I am confident of is that she covered her tracks, because she could not tell that story in public. Right. However it happened. And so it's another example of, look, she's at the top of her game. She's, you know, everything is going so well, but in order to be free, she has to tell only part of the story, or tell a different story to different people. That tells us something really important about what she's doing and what she's
navigating the landscape.
What she's navigating. And what's interesting is some of the plays, and this also goes back to Shirley Graham Du Bois' young adult book in the late 40s. Shirley Graham, she was then later Shirley Graham Du Bois. Where the whole drama is about her and Nathaniel, right? And so in a lot of the play, like rightly, the relationship, the familial but enslaved relationship between the white Wheatleys and Phillis is fascinating.
It's
interesting and so important, and we don't know. And so here's where the historian biographer, I actually moved away from speculating about that. And I've been asked a lot of questions about it, because people don't get as many answers from my book about that as they might have expected. Because what's clear to me is that it's not clear, and it's not clear for reasons. Though one of the reasons it's not clear is actually that all the Wheatleys die off before Phillis.
Right.
They're all gone. So there's no archive. We have fewer letters from the whole white Wheatley family than we have of Phillis.
But then there's Susanna's niece or grandniece.
Then there's the grandniece and her memoir then becomes the basis for all the subsequent stories, or one of the important ones, right? So there's this oral history, right? So important in recreating these stories. And the irony is that it's the white Wheatley oral history that has defined the story.
Yes.
So I call that directly into question, building on some other scholars.
And I think that's important that we say that out loud, that, you know, so much of the later life of Wheatley is crafted through the lens of a young white abolitionist, would-be abolitionist, as opposed to her own story, her own tale. I see folks getting up, so perhaps you want to do the stamp poem.
No, well, maybe, what do we have to, maybe we should move to questions?
Great. Kimmika and David, this is so wonderful. And Kimmika, thank you for your insights and your wonderful questions. And David, thank you for sharing the thought process that went into your book and the 15-year journey that you went on to tell this story in a new and rich way. Let's open it to our audience to see if there are some questions in the room. And we'll also go to our Zoom chat if there's not a question in the room to get us started. But we'll start here in the room. Yes, please.
Hello, this was amazing. My brain is like cracked in a million pieces. I'm so excited to go home and reread Wheatley. So similar to your story, like I came to Phillis Wheatley because I had to say one of her poems in elementary school. There was a play at Quintessence Theater over the summer that was about Wheatley, but it was from the story of a high schooler having to write a book report. So I'm wondering, what do you think it is that, and you reference her in YA books a lot as well in this conversation, what do you think it is about Wheatley that just, I guess, like centralizes her around young people? Because I feel like as I gotten older, I hear about her less, but as a child, it was like she was always in our books in elementary and middle school. You know, you go to the Easter speech and you got to read Phillis Wheatley or Maya Angelou were the two options. But as we got older, it seemed like, I guess we've aged out of Wheatley. And why do you think that is?
While you're thinking, you want me to start? Because, her first published work is at 13. I mean, she appeals to young people because she's doing these tremendously monumental things as a young woman, a young woman. And I think too, because of the political landscape that we find ourselves in, she's not a threat at that age, if that makes sense. Yeah, okay.
Right. I think that, well, I've been seeing the upside of it, so the experience I have is maybe a little bit different because to me, of course, I notice anytime there's any reference to Phillis Wheatley anywhere, and it seems to me that now she's everywhere, and I don't think it's just because I'm noticing because I wrote a book about her. I think that there is a lot more prominence, and I haven't had the sense that my sense has been that a lot more people everywhere have. My experience has been a lot more people everywhere have heard of her, and the what I used to experience as a clear example of the fact that there's not one public, and that that there are things Black people know that most white people don't. That seems to be less so. More of everybody seems to know about her. But I think Kimmika is also right that there's a. But I do wonder if part of the story of her being more prominent for young people is also Kimmika's generation teaching it and getting it into the schools, getting her into the curriculum, right? And that must have made a difference.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, immediately following her death, I think there were these writers who recognized how difficult it was to do what she did, and who kept her alive. And because we were, there were segregated schools, and there were individuals who wanted to resurrect or keep alive the figures that meant so much to the African American experience. But then something happened. And I don't know what that thing was, but something happened where we no longer looked to our history, that it became sort of an albatross. And then folks like Wheatley disappeared. Folks like O.V. Cato disappeared until, I read a book by Bloxon and then went out and wrote a play. And then somebody from the Inquirer took my play and wrote a book. But okay, fine, that's another story. But anyway, I think those things happen, right? I know, I shouldn't do that. I know. But hopefully, hopefully the parents today are willing to share the life story of Wheatley without reservation. They do it in London. The Cultural Archives there. There's an exhibit that's been up for I don't know how long. But hopefully we can return to a time where when we walk into a school in an urban environment, that there are images of Phillis Wheatley, just like there are images of Frederick Douglass.
Selena, do we have a question from our Zoom audience?
Yes. So hi, everyone. Selena here from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, representing our Zoom people. So we have a couple of great questions. Stacy asks, if Phillis Wheatley was so well known in Boston, why was it that her book was published in London?
You want
This is a bit of a judgment call. There's some disagreement about this. I think that it's because by the time first it's because the first attempt to publish her poems was with a printer who started to have some trouble around that time, and publishing a whole book of poems was too much for him, and so then they get more ambitious, but printers in Boston are associated with various political stands. And I think by the time you get to 1770, 1771, 72, the Patriot poets are, the Patriot printers are already, some of whom are actually more sympathetic to her and are willing to say positive things about her when she goes to London. They are already aware that she can be used, that it's embarrassing that she's not free, and what she's doing brings up the issue of slavery in a way that's already embarrassing to those who are making the argument that England is oppressing the colonies, and particularly Boston. So that, I think that is the reason, that is one of the reasons why. But another reason why is that getting published in London was actually a bigger deal and more ambitious. And that seemed by the time you get to 1772, 73, that actually seems more possible. They set things up in terms of patronage with the Countess of Huntingdon and others. It's not like, oh, we can't get published in Boston, we have to be published in, we have to go to London. It's like, oh, like maybe we're even bigger than Boston. And maybe getting published in London is going to circulate more copies here a little bit later than just getting published in Boston would.
Could I also suggest that it's the political economy of the time period, you know, and I'm only suggesting this because I was a park ranger 100 years ago, and used to work in Franklin's print press here in Philly. You know, at that time, paper was made from rags, and it's a very you know complicated process, you know, and the beating and the putting the letters and then the using the press and then you have this, you know, this parchment paper that comes out of it. It's an expensive proposition. And for an enslaved woman to get published, you had to sort of sell subscriptions before the book came to fruition. And there was difficulty in doing that. And I think being an international writer meant not just sales there, as David suggests, but it meant that for the North, I can buy the book and still feel bad and still not feel bad about slavery because it's been published in London. And so it gives it a different kind of gravitas. And it's less expensive because, you know, the philanthropists are paying for it.
Selena, another one from Zoom?
Sure. I know. Let's see. Can you talk about whether or not Phillis Wheatley had friends outside of the Wheatley family? What was her direct relationship to other Africans and Black people in America?
This is one of the themes and arguments of the book from the get-go. I think there's good evidence, which you can see from the contemporary newspapers that I read, that there is an uptick of ships from Africa and enslaved people coming into Boston during and after the 7 Years, toward the end and during after the 7 Years War. So this is the late 1750s, early 1760s. And she's part of a generation, really, a cohort. And that there are a number that you can see them assimilating, getting skilled. Some of them even get referred to as young geniuses in other ways in the very advertisements that sell them or try to recapture them. So she's not alone. And there is no reason at all to think that she is only hanging out with, clearly she's hanging out with some of these daughters of ministers who also write poems and who later in their lives say that they knew her. Clearly she's got people who refer to her as a friend, and she's very interested in friendship, and she has a very capacious definition of friendship. But there's no reason to think that she is not hanging out with Black people her age, and she in the great grandniece of Mrs. Wheatley's memoir, she tells a story where, it's in another one of the Wheatley family reminiscences. There's a story told about her getting scolded for sitting next to the driver, probably also an enslaved person or indentured servant of the Wheatleys, who's Black, who drives her home. She sends her to go. She's at somebody else's house, probably performing her poetry. She said it's raining or it's cold. She sends the carriage to go pick her up, and then she comes back, and she's sitting up front with the driver, and and Mrs. Wheatley is furious, right? Like, so that there's definitely this is her actually. That's clear evidence that her relationships with other Black people was policed and was a problem, but it's also clear evidence that
she transgressed.
Yes, and I don't even think. I think we should just presume that was the case. And then there's Scipio Moorhead, who she wrote a poem for, who was a visual artist and may have painted the painting that the engraving is based on. And
her friend Tanner.
And Ober Tanner, who is referred to in the letter to Samuel Hopkins that is on display downstairs. And as Tara Bynum has argued, Ober is an extremely important friend, but she's the one who saved the letters. So we know about her. There probably were others that we don't know about.
And she was friends with John Peters for 5 years before they were married. So, that friendship probably entailed other African Americans because of the ways in which Peters was entrepreneurial. Yeah.
Great. We have time for one more question in the room. Andrew?
So reading your book and hearing you talk about it, it's clear that this is a project that brings together so many of your passions. So the revolution, slavery, anti-slavery, but also poetry and literature. This is a book by a historian who is confident interpreting Wheatley's poetry. So I wonder how literature scholars have reacted to your readings of Wheatley. I probably should be humble and say the verdict's still out. You don't immediately hear from the people who disagree with you. The people who agree with you write you complimentary emails, and so I think it's going over pretty well. I had published some things before, and I think the one sticking point so far seems to be I found poems in newspapers that were published anonymously that sound like her. And I decided to write an article about them and also include them as an appendix and talk about them while signaling that it's not certain she wrote them. But I think she probably did do that, like most women poets did, publish anonymously. And we know she did it on at least one, it was proven that she did it on at least one other occasion. There are other poems that have been suggested that were probably by her. I'm not the first to grapple with this. I'm just the first to read all the poems in the Boston newspapers from 1760 to 1784 with her on my mind, and to like basically know her voice so well. And so I actually count the number of the number of words that were common to her that show up in these poems. And that's the only way that we can really sort of say, okay, well, maybe there's a probability. So some scholars are not happy about this because this isn't how they do the canonizing business, or this isn't how they do the, that you just can't count. So there will be debate about that. And I mean, it's going to be up to the Wheatley scholars, who basically have much more of a stake. The literary scholars have much more of a stake in exactly which poems are hers or not. And like, that's fine. That's fine. And I expect them not, I expected that they wouldn't all agree. And Vincent Coretta made it very clear that he doesn't agree and that I'm messing with the canon in ways that are inappropriate. Though he's called them, yeah, I don't agree with the way he's characterized these poems that I've found and the arguments I've made for them, but I'm sure he'll have something to say about it in some long review in some literary journal. So that's the answer I've got.
So, oh, sorry, David. Before we end for the evening, we do have one final request from someone in our Zoom audience who is asking if you could recite some of Phillis Wheatley's poetry for the audience before we wrap.
I'd rather hear Kimmika do it.
I think Kimmika, as the poet and the playwright, you might be best suited as well.
And you know, I brought one of her poems. I was prepared. My favorite, on being brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christian, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. Phillis Wheatley Peters.
Kimmika and David, thank you for an amazing evening. This has been great fun, and we've learned so much from both of you. We invite all of you to continue to participate in HSP's programs. If you're not already signed on to our newsletters, to receive notices of great programs like this, you can do so by going to hsp.org/enews, and you can sign on to our newsletter. If you're interested in purchasing HSP's new 200th anniversary book, you can do that from the University of Pennsylvania Press, and we will send you a special code that will get you a 30% discount. If you don't already have David's book, buy it. It's an amazing book. I couldn't put it down.
No,
And
your book.
it really is one of the great books of 2023, and it will endure. So Kimmika and David, thank you so much for a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. You are fabulous.
I think